August 15, 1944. Fort Lewis, Washington. The pine trees swayed in the late summer wind, carrying the sharp scent of resin into the compound. Beyond the wire, Mount Rainier glowed white against a sky so blue it seemed painted. Inside the camp, however, the prisoners' attention was fixed not on the horizon, but on a chalkboard nailed above the canteen counter. The letters, scrawled in ordinary hand, spelled out something extraordinary to German eyes. ICECREAM 10 cents. Coca-Cola 5 cents. 18-year-old Luftwaffe pilot Günter Grave stood frozen in line. His boots scraped the gravel as the men ahead of him shuffled forward. In his hand he clutched a few paper chits, wages for hauling lumber under the Colorado sun. 80 cents. It was more than he had ever been trusted with as a soldier. He could feel the weight of it, flimsy though the slips of paper were. 80 cents, and before him two choices that seemed impossible. He had not tasted ice cream since 1938, back when he was still a boy and Hamburg still seemed invincible. His mother had bought him a cone once, stretching coins she could scarcely spare. He had licked it quickly before it melted, a moment of childhood before the world turned to uniforms and war. As for Coca-Cola, he had never tried it. In Germany, the American drink was almost mythic, whispered about in forbidden jazz clubs, referenced in the swing songs the Gestapo raided. He had thought it as unreachable as the Hollywood stars whose films were banned from German screens. And yet, here it was, offered openly in a prison camp thousands of miles from home. The men behind him whispered, their voices low but urgent. "What is this? Cold coffee?" one asked. Another laughed nervously. "It fizzes." An American trick. They were gaunt from months of meager rations, still haunted by memories of crusts of bread stretched with sawdust and the watery turnip soup of occupied France. The idea of dessert, of choice, seemed absurd. The line edged forward. Inside the mess hall, the clang of ladles against steel trays rang out, echoing like distant bells. The air was thick with the smell of fried dough and sugar, scents so rich they clung to the prisoners' clothing. Guards stood at easy watch, rifles slung casually across shoulders, their expressions relaxed. No shouting, no dogs, just the steady rhythm of food being served, the steady hum of men rediscovering what it meant to eat. When Graue reached the counter, the corporal at the register looked at him with a half-smile and said in broken German, "Both, if you want." The words hung in the air. Both. Ice cream and Coca-Cola. His hand trembled. He thought of his mother, likely boiling cabbage leaves in Hamburg. He thought of his younger sister, queuing for bread that crumbled between her fingers. And here he was, a prisoner, allowed to choose between luxuries denied even to German civilians. He nodded quickly, almost guiltily, and laid down his chits. A Coke bottle hissed as the cap came off, the fizz leaping against his nose. The ice cream, pale and sweet, burned his teeth with its cold. He held both in his hands, the absurdity washing over him. For a moment he was not a prisoner, not a defeated soldier, but a boy again, tasting sugar and fizz as if the war did not exist. Around him his comrades muttered in disbelief. One laughed through a mouthful of ice cream, another pocketed a sugar packet for his mother back home. "If this is defeat," someone whispered, "then what was victory?" They had been told Americans were decadent, soft, incapable of enduring hardship. Yet here was proof to the contrary, proof not of weakness, but of abundance so overwhelming it spilled over even to the enemy. The truth lay in arithmetic as much as in kindness. Records show that by 1944, the U.S. Army allocated the same daily rations to prisoners as to its own soldiers. 3,600 to 4,000 calories per day, bread 750 grams, meat 140 to 170 grams, potatoes 1,500 grams. Prisoners could buy extras in the canteen, candy, cigarettes, coffee, even Coca-Cola. Feeding them cost the War Department just 25 cents per head per day, a small fraction of the billions poured into bombers, tanks, and Liberty ships. Yet for the Germans, it was evidence of something far greater. That night, Grau sat on his bunk with a stub of pencil, writing a letter he knew would likely never be delivered. "Mother," he began, "today I drank a thing called Coca-Cola. I ate ice cream as though it were 1938 again. They serve us meat twice a week. I eat better here, as a prisoner, than you at home." He paused, ashamed at the words, then folded the paper anyway. It would be censored, perhaps destroyed, but the memory was his to keep. Years later, long after the Reich had crumbled into rubble, Greve would recall that first day in Fort Lewis. He would remember the fizz of the Coke, the shock of sugar on his tongue, the stunned silence of his fellow prisoners as they realized America's most devastating weapon was not its tanks or planes, but its ability to feed even its enemies better than Germany could feed its citizens. In that moment, with barbed wire around him and snow-capped mountains beyond, he had tasted the truth of defeat. November 1944, Camp Carson, Colorado. The sun had barely cleared the Rockies when the trucks pulled through the gates. Their engines coughed in the cold, and their exhaust hung white in the frosted morning air. Soldiers jumped down from the running boards, boots crunching on gravel, and swung the tailgates open. Crates, sacks, and tins appeared in neat, endless rows. Sergeant Betty Morrison pulled her cap tighter and stepped forward, clipboard in hand. She had the posture of someone who had grown up working, straight-backed, brisk, but with a quiet steadiness in her step. The driver handed her a manifest stamped with the quartermaster's seal. Her pencil ticked off the loads as they were carried past. 1,200 dozen eggs, 2,000 pounds of potatoes, 500 pounds of butter, flour by the hundredweight, coffee by the tin. It looked less like a ration delivery than a merchant fleet unloading at a dock. Morrison had grown up in the Dust Bowl, on a farm where a single egg stretched across 3 children was a feast. She remembered the sound of her mother whisking a thin egg mixture in a chipped bowl, praying it would puff up enough to fool their stomachs. Now she was responsible for feeding 12,000 German prisoners of war 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. Inside the kitchens, the work was already underway. The M1937 field ranges hissed with heat, their stovetops crowded with kettles the size of barrels. Flour dusted the air. The cooks worked in a rhythm as precise as drill. Sacks poured, spoons scraped, ladles clanged against trays. Steam fogged the windows, and the smell of fresh bread seeped through the entire camp. Morrison walked the line with her charts. Every meal was calculated to the last calorie, every pound of food logged. The War Department set the standard. Prisoners would eat the same rations as American soldiers, about 3,600 calories per day. Each man received 750 grams of bread, more than 1.5 pounds. Meat allocations ran between 140 and 170 grams daily. Potatoes, their favorite staple, came in heaping portions of 1,500 grams. It was not a kindness. It was policy. Compliance with the 1929 Geneva Convention and, just as important, a display of American abundance. Feeding each prisoner cost only 25 cents a day, less than a single artillery shell. That afternoon, Morrison made her rounds through the mess hall. Prisoners lined up in twos, helmets long since confiscated, faces drawn tight with suspicion. They carried enamel trays in their hands, watching the line of food with the hunger of men who had learned never to expect plenty. The cooks ladled out beef stew, bread, potatoes, and coffee. Steam rose into the chilly air. The Germans hesitated. Were they allowed to come back for more? A guard, a lanky private with a Texas drawl, called out in broken German, "More? Ja, take all you want. Eat what you take." The line surged. Men shuffled back for seconds, some for thirds. They stuffed bread into their tunics, still half believing it must be a trick. One man wept quietly as he spooned hot stew into his mouth. Others laughed nervously, shaking their heads. Morrison stood at the corner, clipboard against her chest, watching enemies rediscover what it meant to be full. Outside the wire, Americans at home endured rationing, sugar stamps, gasoline limits, meatless days. Housewives hoarded lard tins. Children carried ration books to the store. Many civilians resented the treatment given to the POWs' letters poured into Congress. Why feed steak to Nazis when American families stretched hamburger? Morrison knew those complaints well. She had read them in the newspapers, but she also knew the calculation behind it. Food itself was a weapon. By feeding their enemies better than the Reich could feed its own people, America delivered a blow that propaganda could not counter. Every bite of hot stew, every slice of white bread, every pat of butter was a reminder that America's capacity dwarfed Germany's. That night, Morrison closed her ledger in the office, the ink still drying on the day's tallies. Calories, costs, weights, all neat columns of arithmetic. She was tired. Her uniform smelled of flour and smoke, but her conscience was steady. She knew her duty wasn't glamorous. She wasn't in Normandy or the Ardennes. She was here, running numbers and rations. Yet she understood this too was war, quiet, relentless, victorious. Outside, the mountains turned purple in the dusk. In the mess hall, the ovens still glowed, preparing bread for the morning. Morrison stacked her papers, extinguished the lamp, and whispered into the silence, "Feed them like soldiers, and they'll remember who fed them." December 1944. Camp Trinidad, Colorado. Snow fell in silence across the Sangre de Cristo foothills, whitening the fences and dusting the watchtowers. The barracks creaked in the wind, each long wooden building filled with the steady breath of captured soldiers. Inside Barracks 12, Hauptmann Wilhelm von Steuben sat on a narrow bunk with his greatcoat pulled tight around him. He had carried that coat through the deserts of Tunisia, where the sand scoured every seam and the sun seemed bent on bleaching the soul. Now, in Colorado snow, it felt like a relic of a different world. Captured at Kasserine Pass in early 1943, von Steuben had commanded a panzer company once proud to serve under Rommel. His men had believed they were the sharp tip of Germany's spear, destined to drive the British into the sea. They had learned otherwise in a valley filled with smoke and broken armor, where American artillery spoke with a weight of metal no German battalion could match. Now, almost 2 years later, the same men stood in chow lines, spoons in hand, staring at American generosity as if it were sorcery. Von Steuben opened his leather-bound notebook. It was half diary, half report, written as though someone someday would need to know how an officer carried himself in defeat. He scribbled down the day's menu: beef stew, white bread, potatoes, coffee. He added a note. The men astonished. Ordered them to maintain discipline. America seeks to soften us. His handwriting pressed deep into the page, the strokes harsh. He knew food could do what bombs could not, weaken loyalty, dissolve iron discipline into gratitude. The irony struck him hard. He had seen his mother's letters from Munich, each shorter, each filled with veiled descriptions of hardship. Neighbors boiling nettles for soup, children chewing crusts bulked with sawdust, housewives queuing for hours only to be told the flour was gone. And yet here, across the ocean, the enemy fed his men meat twice a week and potatoes in abundance. Some of his soldiers whispered that they had gained weight in captivity. Von Steuben tried to silence such talk. It corroded discipline, undermined dignity. Still, he could not deny the evidence. The barracks smelled faintly of coffee, the bitter American brew the prisoners had first rejected as too strong. Now they clutched the tin cups with both hands, inhaling steam as if it were warmth itself. Outside, guards stamped their boots against the cold. One of them, a boy no older than 20, hummed a tune as he walked the perimeter. Von Steuben wondered if he had fought at all, or if his war was just pacing behind barbed wire, rifle on shoulder, humming through the snow. The officer closed his notebook and stood. He moved through the barracks, stopping at each bunk. "Remember who you are," he said in German. "We are soldiers of the Reich. This food is not a gift, it is bait." Some men nodded, but their eyes betrayed them. He saw relief there, even gratitude. The longer the war dragged on, the harder it became to believe in slogans about destiny and superiority. A paper had been tacked to the bulletin board by the mess hall. Von Steuben stopped to read it later that night. On one side, the camp administration posted casualty figures from the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge was raging in Europe, though here it was just numbers typed on a sheet. On the other side, a neatly typed menu listed Thursday's meal: turkey, potatoes, gravy, bread, coffee, dessert. Two realities side by side: German boys freezing in the Ardennes with failing supply lines, and German prisoners in Colorado about to eat better than their families at home. He pulled his coat tighter. Snowflakes landed on the leather cover of his notebook and melted into dark blotches. He wrote one more line before returning to his bunk. "They win because they can feed even their captives like kings." November 23, 1944. Thanksgiving Day, Camp Carson, Colorado. The mess hall roared like a turbine that morning. Steam poured from the kitchen vents, rolling across the snow-dusted yard in great clouds. Inside, the heat struck every man who entered. The blast of ovens, the hiss of kettles, the smell of roasting meat so rich it seemed almost unreal. The Germans filed in 2 by 2, enamel trays clutched in their hands. The line stretched nearly out the door, prisoners stamping their feet to keep warm as the scent of turkey drifted toward them. Guards stood by, rifles slung casually, watching but not tense. This was not a day for discipline. It was a day for demonstration. At the head of the line, Sergeant Betty Morrison moved briskly between the counters, clipboard under her arm, checking portion sizes. She had spent the last week preparing for this meal, calculating totals with the precision of an engineer: 2 pounds of turkey per man, potatoes by the ton. Dressing and cranberry sauce, vegetables, bread, butter, and pie. It was an arithmetic of plenty. Every serving measured not to conserve, but to guarantee excess. One of the cooks, sweat dripping down his brow despite the cold outside, called out as he slid another tray of roasted birds from the oven. "That makes 200, Sarge." "Next batch in 20 minutes," Morrison nodded and made a note. Somewhere in her head she heard her father's voice, a Dust Bowl farmer who once swore he'd never see the day when wheat was wasted. Yet here she was, ensuring that enemy prisoners had all they could eat and more. The first German stepped to the counter. Ladles poured thick gravy, scoops piled mashed potatoes high, slabs of turkey slid steaming onto trays. The men hesitated, glancing at each other, unsure if seconds were permitted. A young guard, perhaps sensing their doubt, grinned and said in clumsy German, "More? Ja, take all you want, just eat what you take." The line surged. Some men piled their trays to near toppling. Others moved more cautiously, but every face showed astonishment. A few even laughed, a sound Morrison hadn't heard from them before. One soldier stared at the butter dish as though it were a relic from another age. Another quietly slipped a sugar packet into his tunic pocket, whispering that he would save it for his mother when he returned home. By the time the prisoners sat down, the hall echoed with the scrape of forks and the murmur of disbelief. They ate quickly at first, then more slowly, savoring each bite as if trying to stretch the moment. Butter melted across bread so white it looked bleached. Cranberry sauce gleamed jewel red on the plates. And then the pies came out: pumpkin, apple, pecan. each slice a staggering reminder of a country whose farms could produce so much it seemed inexhaustible. Morrison watched from the side. She had seen these men sullen, suspicious, sometimes openly defiant. Now they were just young men at a holiday table, shoulders slumped in relief as their hunger gave way to fullness. She thought of her brothers, one somewhere in France, another still training stateside, neither of them eating this well. She thought of her neighbors back home, stretching ration stamps, making coffee from chicory, grumbling about enemy prisoners being fed better than American civilians. And yet she knew why this was done. Food was more than sustenance. It was strategy. While German civilians at home survived on 1,200 to 1,600 calories per day, these prisoners were consuming more than 3,500 in a single sitting. It was arithmetic the Reich could not compete with. No propaganda could convince a soldier who had tasted turkey, butter, and pie that America was weak. In the face of such abundance, ideology crumbled. When the meal was finished, the hall quieted. Trays clattered into bins, men leaned back in their chairs, some pressing their hands to their stomachs as though they could not believe they had been allowed this. A few exchanged glances of shame, knowing their families in Germany would be eating turnips and ersatz bread that night. One man carefully folded the paper menu into his pocket as if it were contraband, something to prove later that this day had really happened. As Morrison left the hall, she paused at the door. Behind her, the Germans were humming softly, a tune she couldn't place. For a moment, it sounded almost like home. A chorus of men, full and warm, in a place where even enemies were fed with dignity. Outside, the snow began to fall again, flakes swirling in the cold air. The mountains stood silent in the distance, vast and unshaken. Inside the wire, the prisoners carried with them the memory of a meal that defied everything they had been told about America. It was not kindness that broke them, but the arithmetic of abundance, an arithmetic no German general could outfight. The train cut across the winter plains, a long chain of Pullman cars pulled by a steam locomotive whose plume stretched like a banner into the frozen sky. Inside, the German prisoners sat stiffly on the worn seats, their eyes darting from the windows to the guards who lounged in the aisles. They had expected cattle cars, the kind of transport the Wehrmacht used for its own prisoners and laborers. Instead, they found themselves riding in upholstered seats heated by coal stoves with the faint scent of tobacco and wool hanging in the air. One of the younger men whispered to his companion, "They treat their enemies better than we treated our allies." His voice was bitter, but tinged with awe. The guards, mostly National Guard troops from Kansas and Missouri, barely glanced at them. One even offered a cigarette. The prisoners refused at first, wary of tricks, but soon smoke drifted through the car, mingling with the rattle of wheels on iron. At each stop, the train crew unloaded bundles of supplies. Hot food appeared at intervals, brought aboard in insulated containers. Meat stew, potatoes, coffee, again and again, meals were served in quantities the Germans could not believe. One U-boat sailor, his face gaunt from months at sea, muttered that he had eaten better on the journey to captivity than he had during the entire last patrol. The irony hung heavy among them. The train rolled through Nebraska farmland, snow dusting the fields. Outside the windows, barns stood sturdy and red, and silos loomed like towers of plenty. Farmers in thick coats and ear-flap hats worked even in the cold, driving tractors that dwarfed the horse-drawn wagons the Germans remembered from home. Each field, each machine, seemed to whisper a truth. Here was a land that could never be starved into submission. By late afternoon, the train ground to a halt near a small town. The prisoners were marched off in rows, boots crunching on frozen gravel. Trucks waited to carry them to the work details. Their destination, sugar beet farms in need of laborers. America's harvest would not pause for war, and German hands were conscripted to the fields. The farms were nothing like what the men had known in Europe. Here, machines dominated. The tractors rumbled like tanks, hauling wagons piled high. The barns smelled of hay and diesel, not just manure. And everywhere, food, grain stacked in silos, potatoes piled high in sheds, bins overflowing with corn. Some of the prisoners muttered that Americans wasted more in a day than Germans consumed in a week. At noon, the farmers' wives brought lunch. The prisoners sat on crates, steam rising from tin pails filled with stew, bread, and slices of apple pie wrapped in wax paper. One man stared at the pie as if it were a mirage. Another took a bite and closed his eyes, whispering, "This is not war. This is madness." The farmers themselves said little. Some glared, still raw from news of sons killed in France. Others treated the Germans with quiet civility, a handshake or a nod. One farmer's teenage boy, about the same age as the prisoners, watched with wide eyes as the men ate. His brother had fallen in Normandy that summer. He could not understand how the enemy sat here at his mother's table, eating strawberries with cream, while his brother lay in French soil. That night back on the train, the prisoners whispered among themselves. They had seen abundance beyond imagining. Farms with enough food to feed whole battalions, families so prosperous they could serve dessert to their enemies, machines that multiplied labor 100-fold. No speech from Hitler, no promise of miracle weapons could erase the evidence. The officer in charge of the car, Hauptmann von Steuben, made a final note in his leather-bound book. "We traveled in comfort. We ate hot meals. They waste what we lack. If Germany's strength is discipline, America's is abundance, and abundance will always win." Outside, the train rattled eastward under the winter stars, carrying its cargo of men who had begun to understand that the war was already lost. Not on the battlefield, but in the arithmetic of food and steel that rolled past every farm fence and filled every mess tin. The wind cut sharp across the foothills, rattling the barbed wire and driving snow against the guard towers. Inside the camp, the prisoners clustered in the mess hall, trays balanced in their hands, the air heavy with steam and the clatter of metal utensils. The meal was ordinary by American standards: beef stew thick with potatoes, a slice of white bread soft enough to tear with fingers, a mug of coffee. Yet to the Germans, it was a daily revelation. For weeks now they had tried to make sense of it. How could their enemy feed hundreds of thousands of captives so well day after day without fail? Back in Germany, their families queued for hours to collect half loaves of bread bulked with sawdust. Children were thin, cheeks hollow. Here, even as prisoners, they were full. Some admitted quietly that they had put on weight since their capture. At one table, a group of U-boat men muttered over their trays. One, his cap pulled low, said, "This is propaganda. They want us to think they are invincible." Another shook his head, stabbing a piece of beef with his fork. "Propaganda cannot conjure this much meat. Look around you." He gestured at the steaming kettles in the kitchen, the sacks of flour stacked by the door, the ease with which the cooks ladled out portions without counting. This is not theater. This is capacity. The statistics backed him. The United States, by 1944, was producing food on a scale the Germans could not fathom. Victory Gardens alone yielded more than 1 billion tons of vegetables, grown in backyards and empty lots by housewives and schoolchildren. Corn acreage had risen 9%, wheat 15%, oats 22%. Canning centers, 6,000 strong, churned out 4 billion jars of preserved food in a single year. By comparison, Germany stripped its occupied territories to feed itself and still starved its people. The prisoners did not know all the numbers, but they saw the evidence every day: bread without fillers, potatoes by the pound, meat served regularly, and perhaps most shockingly, waste. Leftovers scraped from trays into barrels, food tossed away without a second thought. In Germany, they would have fought over those scraps. Here, Americans discarded them. The sheer waste carried its own message. This was a nation so rich it could afford to feed its prisoners better than its enemies fed their own soldiers. Hauptmann von Steuben watched his men eat and made notes in his journal. He wrote of the endless bread, the potatoes, the steady rhythm of meals that arrived without disruption. He wrote of the quiet erosion of discipline, how even the most loyal men softened when their stomachs were full. He knew the war was not decided only by battles in the Ardennes or on the Eastern Front. It was decided here, too, in a mess hall where the arithmetic of calories told its own story. On the other side of the hall, Sergeant Betty Morrison observed as trays were cleared. She had been running rations for months now, balancing ledgers with soldierly precision. She knew the cost: 25 cents per prisoner per day. A quarter to prove to the world and to the prisoners themselves that democracy could outproduce dictatorship. She had read letters in the papers, civilians angry that POWs ate better than they did. But she understood something those letters did not. This was not softness. It was strategy. One prisoner, a gaunt man from the Africa Corps, lingered over his coffee, staring into the dark liquid. "If this is their treatment of enemies," he murmured to his table-mates, "imagine how their own people live." No one answered. They all knew what their families lived on: turnip bread, ersatz coffee, and rumors of starvation. That night, as lights dimmed and the snow kept falling, the camp was quiet. Men lay in their bunks, full stomachs turning restlessly with thoughts they could not quiet. Somewhere beyond the barbed wire, trains rumbled past, carrying wheat, beef, and corn, across a continent that seemed bottomless in its resources. The revelation had begun to settle in. This was not luck nor temporary fortune. It was a system. Factories, farms, railroads, ships, all moving in harmony, producing enough not only to equip armies and allies, but to feed even the enemy. For men raised on the creed of German superiority, it was a bitter truth. Yet every full stomach made it harder to deny. December 24th, 1944. Camp Trinidad, Colorado. Snow blanketed the barracks in silence, the kind of thick, muffling fall that turned the whole camp into a pale, frozen landscape. Inside the mess hall, the ovens glowed red, filling the air with warmth and the smell of roasting turkeys. The prisoners filed in slowly, boots wet from the drifts, trays in hand. They had grown accustomed to full meals, but tonight something different hung in the air, an unmistakable sense of feast. The cooks had worked for days. Morrison and her staff had overseen shipments of poultry and vegetables measured not in pounds but in tons. Turkeys carved and laid in trays, potatoes mashed by the barrel, stuffing ladled out by the shovelful. Cranberries, bright red, gleamed on the tables, and pies, pumpkin, apple, pecan, lined the counters in ranks as neat as soldiers on parade. The prisoners stared. Many had not seen such a meal in years. Some muttered that their families back in Germany would eat turnips and cabbage soup this night, if they were lucky. The memory of home tightened throats, but the smell of the food before them was irresistible. Guards waved them forward, reminding them in clumsy German, "Take what you want, eat what you take." By the time the prisoners sat, the hall resounded with the scrape of forks and the murmur of voices. Men ate hungrily at first, then slowed, savoring. One stared at his plate of turkey and whispered, almost to himself, "In Berlin, they boil cats. Here they serve pie." His table-mates nodded, some swallowing hard, not from food, but from shame. In the corner, a group of prisoners broke into song. Stille Nacht, sung in low, steady voices, rose through the mess hall. Others joined, until the hall filled with the hymn's solemn beauty. The guards, standing along the walls, listened in silence. For a moment the war seemed to fall away, replaced by the harmony of men who, for one night, were simply human again. Across the ocean, Germany endured what came to be called the Hunger Winter. Rations had dropped to little more than 1,200 calories a day for civilians, and in some cities barely 1,000. Bread was stretched with sawdust, coffee replaced with acorns and chicory. Families boiled grass, nettles, and potato peels for soup. Children grew thin and pale, while Allied bombers turned food warehouses into rubble. Letters trickled into the camps filled with desperate words from mothers and wives. The men who received them folded the pages quickly, hiding them from their comrades, ashamed at what they revealed. The contrast was unbearable. Here in captivity, men were fed meat, bread, vegetables, even luxuries like butter and sugar. Back home, their children starved. Each bite they took seemed to drive home the widening gap between what Germany promised and what America delivered. For some, it cracked faith in the Reich beyond repair. Hauptmann von Steuben recorded the evening in his journal. Christmas Eve. Turkey, bread, potatoes, cranberries, pie. They fed us better than kings. My men sang carols with tears in their eyes. I told them discipline must remain, but their faces betrayed them. They know the truth. He closed the book sharply, but the words were already burned into memory. Sergeant Morrison, standing in the doorway, watched the scene unfold. She thought of her own family, scattered by war, one brother overseas, her parents scraping by on ration stamps. She felt a pang of guilt as she saw the prisoners eat pie her family could not have. Yet she also understood. This was war in another form. America's power lay not only in tanks and planes, but in its capacity to feed, clothe, and overwhelm with abundance. As the evening wound down, trays clattered into bins, and the prisoners drifted back to their barracks. Outside, snowflakes caught in the light of the watchtower beams, falling steadily over wire and wood. Inside, men lay on their bunks with full stomachs, humming carols softly into the night. In Berlin, the same night, families huddled in unheated apartments, wrapping children in blankets and boiling cabbage water to share. The contrast was more devastating than any shelling. In the arithmetic of war, calories were as decisive as bullets, and in that balance, America had already won. January 1945. Camp Carson, Colorado. Snow fell in thick silence, clinging to the guard towers and muffling the crunch of boots on the packed parade ground. The prisoners huddled in their barracks, whispering about the Ardennes. Rumors traveled faster than truth. Hitler's armor had broken through the forests of Belgium. The Americans were retreating. Perhaps the Reich still had a chance. Yet when the dinner bell clanged, those whispers faltered. The smell of fresh bread and thick stew drifted from the kitchens, cutting through the cold. Men pulled on coats and lined up beneath the dim lights. Inside the mess hall, the heat hit their faces, steam rising from kettles and trays. Ladles plunged into pots, filling bowls with chunks of beef and potatoes. Half loaves of bread, crust golden, were handed out without rationing. Coffee poured black and hot into tin mugs. No guards counted slices, no one barked limits. Men returned for seconds without fear. For soldiers hardened on iron rations, 300 grams of black bread with sawdust fillers, ersatz coffee brewed from acorns, the sight was disorienting. An Africa Corps sergeant sneered, "They fatten us like pigs to slaughter our will," but his spoon clattered against the bottom of the bowl. Hunger was stronger than ideology. Von Steuben, once a tank commander in Tunisia, opened his leather notebook beneath the table. His pencil scratched, "Discipline erodes." Full stomachs silence slogans. Men whisper that defeat here tastes better than victory at home. He had heard reports of German units slaughtering their horses to survive. Yet here, in captivity, beef appeared twice a week. In the guardroom, Sergeant Betty Morrison checked the ration sheets. Each POW, 3,600 calories a day, equal to American soldiers. Bread 750 grams, meat 140, potatoes in abundance. The numbers seemed impossible, an empire of food, but they balanced every time. Morrison had grown up in Depression-era Iowa, when her family counted every egg. Now she signed papers ensuring enemy soldiers ate better than some American civilians. What struck the prisoners most wasn't just the quantity, but the rhythm. Meals arrived on time, every day, regardless of blizzards or battles in Europe. Trains kept rolling, warehouses stayed full, kitchens never paused. The steadiness shattered faith more than any film reel could. Germany promised tomorrow. America delivered today. Nebraska farmland. February 1945. The trucks rattled to a stop on a dirt road, their exhaust steaming in the frozen air. Prisoners jumped down, boots crunching snow. They squinted across endless white fields, barns fat with grain, silos looming like towers. Work was familiar. Sugar beets pulled from the frozen ground, corn shoveled into bins, wheat bagged for shipment. But the scale astonished them. Tractors larger than wagons roared past, their steel teeth turning earth that in Germany required entire regiments with spades. A single American farm seemed to outproduce a German province. At noon, the farmers' wives arrived with food, sandwiches thick with ham and cheese, jars of dill pickles, slices of pie wrapped in wax paper. A boy carried milk still warm from the cow. The prisoners sat on crates, eating in silence. One man slipped a sugar cube into his pocket, whispering that he would mail it to his daughter if censors allowed. Another muttered, "Better to be a prisoner here than free in Hamburg." Letters told the other side. A wife traded her wedding ring for potatoes. Children fainted from hunger at school, families huddled in unheated apartments, ration cards granting barely 1,000 calories a day. One letter described boiling wallpaper paste into soup. Men folded the pages quickly, ashamed to reveal their full bellies. By March, Nebraska employed 12,000 German POWs, logging a 91% work rate. Each man earned 80 cents a day, enough for cigarettes, candy, even Coca-Cola from camp canteens. The arithmetic was crushing. America fed its soldiers, civilians, allies, and nearly 400,000 prisoners at once. Germany couldn't feed its own. One prisoner scribbled in his journal, "They waste more than we eat." If abundance is a weapon, they have already won. That night, under a prairie sky sharp with stars, the men whispered in their bunks. The war was still raging, but their conclusion was unanimous. Germany's defeat was sealed not just in the fields of Europe, but in the breadbaskets of America. Camp Carson, May 9, 1945. The Reich was dead. Radios crackled with surrender, guards cheered, prisoners stared at the floorboards, some wept, others clenched fists in silence. Meals changed overnight. No more ice cream in the canteens, meat served less often. Yet bowls of stew, bread by the half loaf, potatoes heaped high. These still outweighed what a family ration card in Berlin could buy in a week. Captives ate more than the free. Von Steuben wrote tersely, "Our leaders said we were chosen, superior. Today superiority is bred. We do not have it. They do." That evening, guards wheeled in a projector. The barracks went dark, film flickering on canvas. The reels showed camps, skeletal figures stumbling from wooden huts, corpses stacked like firewood. Some prisoners shouted, "Propaganda!" But the images silenced most. They realized the same Reich that had starved its people had built death factories. America, their captor, had given them butter, coffee, cigarettes. Morrison stood at the back, arms folded. She had spent 2 years balancing ledgers so that thousands of enemies ate on schedule. Watching the film, she understood her work differently. Food had been proof, stripping away illusions. As the lights flicked back on, a POW muttered to her, "If you can feed enemies like this, perhaps you were never our enemies." His words echoed through the silence. Outside, trains thundered eastward, hauling grain, tanks, steel. Victory had not slowed the machine. Germany had built rockets. America had built abundance. The outcome was written in every meal. Spring, 1946, Bremerhaven. The Liberty ship groaned into port, gulls circling above. On deck, hundreds of POWs leaned against the rails, silent, staring at the ruins. Cranes jutted like broken ribs, houses roofless, children scavenging crusts and rubble. Von Steuben clutched his notebook. Inside, numbers from America. 750 grams bread daily, 140 grams meat, potatoes without limit. Pie at Christmas. He looked at thin children on the dock and knew those numbers were indictments. In Munich, his mother lived in one room of a bombed tenement, ration card granting 1,000 calories. She embraced him, then pulled back in disbelief. "You look well fed," she whispered. He had no answer. Captivity had nourished him better than freedom. Rumors spread quickly. POWs told of Coca-Cola in Texas, pumpkin pie in Colorado, butter spread thick. Families dismissed it at first as fantasy, until more men returned with the same stories. The propaganda crumbled. Sacrifice had brought only hunger. American decadence meant bread without sawdust and coffee that was real. Von Steuben wrote bitterly, "We built rockets while our children starved. They built bread, ships, planes, and shared them with their enemies. Some men longed to go back. They had tasted America's order, its calm abundance, its strange mix of strictness and generosity. In the 1950s, thousands would return, this time as emigrants, chasing the memory of a land where captivity had felt like a glimpse of the future. West Germany, 1955. Markets bustled again, coal smoke and bread mingling in the air. Cranes rebuilt skylines. Children ran in clean shoes. Among the crowds moved men who carried secret memories. Prisoners once, witnesses now. They spoke in quiet tones, of Coca-Cola in Texas fizzing like lightning on their tongues, of turkey dinners in Colorado, pumpkin pie that seemed mythic, of guards who handed out cigarettes and said, "Eat your fill." They had seen America with their own stomachs, and no propaganda could erase it. Von Steuben, now a teacher, tapped his notebook before a classroom. Wars are not won by hunger. They are won by systems that can feed even their enemies. His students, born after the war, stared wide-eyed. To them, butter and pie sounded ordinary. To him, it was proof of power greater than tanks. By the mid-1950s, more than 35,000 former POWs had emigrated to America. They became farmers, machinists, even U.S. soldiers in Korea. When asked why, they answered simply, "Because I knew what America was, even behind barbed wire." That autumn, Günter Grawe returned to America at 29. Once torn between ice cream and Coca-Cola in a Fort Lewis canteen, now he bicycled through American streets as a guest. "Your mess halls showed me who you were," he told his hosts, "and I never forgot." The war's most devastating weapon had not been the atomic bomb nor the endless Sherman tanks. It had been food, served predictably, generously, even to enemies. That abundance dismantled illusions and turned captives into witnesses. The legacy endured. Every bite of white bread remembered, every letter home describing pie and potatoes, every prisoner who saw waste barrels filled with food Germany never had. The truth was simple, carried across decades. Democracy had triumphed not only in steel and fire, but in butter and bread.